All right, I think we will go ahead and get started this morning. Thank you all for joining us for today's program, Coronavirus Impact on Business Valuation. We have Scott Hoyles and Tony Oman joining us from Olson Thielen. This is our final program in our Sponsor Week CLE series. Thank you, Scott and Tony, for joining us. For all of the attendees, excuse me, if you have any questions, please go ahead and type them in the chat box and we will get to them throughout the program. Everyone's camera has been turned off and you have all been muted. So go ahead and enjoy your coffee and your breakfast this morning and sit back and enjoy the program. Scott and Tony, take it away.
All right, thank you, Jennifer. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to enjoy my coffee too, if you don't mind. Thank you very much for joining us. It's beautiful sunshine out today, so I was wondering how many people were going to play hooky on us today. But maybe you are. Maybe you're sitting out on your deck. Maybe you're sitting in your home office. I'm actually in my office today. One of the rare days I'm in my office. Crazy times right now, right? But we have to enjoy it. My name is Scott Hoyles. I'm a principal with Olson Thielen. I specifically work in the tax area, but I also lead our business valuation team. And we're going to take the opportunity today to help basically introduce what the coronavirus is, how that's impacting business valuations. And it's impacting it definitely. And I think it's kind of going both ways, but Tony's going to get into a little more detail on that. We also want to go over a little bit of an overview of what business valuation is all about, because there's some things Tony and I would really like attorneys especially to understand what business valuation people are about and what kind of business valuation people you should probably be looking for in order to pick the right people to do your valuations. My background basically is I'm in public accounting, obviously. I've been in the tax world for about 20 years. I was also a auditor when I first started at Olson Thielen for 2 years. I also was a controller for a manufacturing company for 14 years. I also owned a retail business for 3 years. So I have a varied background, which when we bring that into business valuation is very helpful. Now, Tony will introduce himself and you'll see he has a little bit of a different background also, but all of these different backgrounds help us in the valuation world. So Tony, why don't you introduce yourself and then I'll get us kicked off with the overview.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. Yeah, so my name is Tony Oman. I'm the manager here in Olson Thielen. I focus exclusively on business valuation work. About our practice, we'll do valuation work across the board. You know, we do a lot of gift and estate work, other what I'll call general litigation, could be divorce work, lost profit work, financial reporting, and also working with business owners on various decision support situations, M&A work. So that's a little bit of our practice. I've been doing appraisal work for 6 years, and prior to my time in a consulting role here in a PA firm, I was working mostly in corporate finance roles, mostly with IBM. So my background is corporate finance and more recently here, specific appraisal work and business valuation.
And Tony, your degree, you're not an accountant, right? You're working at a CPA firm. What's your degree in?
Yeah, so I have a good question. I have a degree in economics and an MBA. So I have a little bit of a different background than some of the folks both in our firm, but even from other appraisers who kind of come up through the traditional CPA route. My credential is I'm an accredited senior appraiser with the American Society of Appraisers. I think Scott's going to touch on that a little bit more, but yeah, just my particular background is a little bit unique. But I guess in the appraisal world, there's lots of different backgrounds and people come kind of through that in lots of different ways.
All right, thanks, Tony. So I want to get into a little bit of a general overview. And usually when when I give presentations, I like to be able to give a joke, but you know, I can't see your response. So it's a little difficult to give a joke when I can't even see a response. So I don't know if you're liking it or not. And plus I'm a CPA, you're an attorney. I mean, we kind of can have some fun with that. We're going to leave it alone for now. So there are some things here that Tony and I want you guys to understand. An appraiser is not a client's advocate. Now you may be saying, hold it, we hired you. You need to do what we would like you to do, right? Well, not necessarily. So we have standards we have to uphold, just like attorneys have standards they have to uphold. But we have standards we have to uphold in order to make the valuation come out the way that it should. Usually we're looking at fair market value for the valuation we're going to be doing. Who is the client? The client normally would be, especially working with attorneys, would be the attorney, because we're looking for that attorney-client privilege. So, but we're going to be working with your clients because basically we're going to gather the information directly from them, just because there's a lot of information we're going to be getting. But one thing we just really want you to understand is, you know, we're not advocating necessarily for your client. We're going to give you a fair market value. Now, that doesn't always work, obviously, with the defense, right? Defense wants to get their own valuation if they don't like what we did, and they'll come up with their numbers. So it still looks like we're the advocate, but there's opportunities where, yes, we'll listen and you know, depending on the picture, the projection that's going to be there, it may seem like we're an advocate, but we're still going to give a fair market value of the business, of the assets we're looking at. And what are appraisers typically focus in different niche areas. So when we think of appraisals, we're looking at different types. Real estate, we're looking at personal property, business valuation and intangibles. And Tony mentioned that's really what we do here at Olson Thielen. We do business valuation and intangibles. But then it gets down to art, gems, jewelry. So you're really getting specific. The reason we're bringing that up to you is when you're doing an estate tax return, or you're doing some planning, you're doing some gifting, businesses, you're looking at litigation issues, you're going to want to make sure you have the right appraiser to value the assets that you're looking at. You're not going to hire us to do real estate. Now, you can hire us, but we're going to farm that out to somebody else that does real estate. Now, we may work with the real estate appraiser and take their numbers, put it into our report, especially if it's a real estate partnership that has other assets sitting in it. Yeah, we're going to probably work with them, or if there's discounts to be involved. But usually we really want you to focus on who is the valuator that you need for the particular asset that you're valuing. Business valuation is also not an audit or a forensic exercise. This is a good point because I think most of the clients, if you talk to them, they may think, wow, you know what, they were very invasive, because we ask a lot of questions. We like to get 5 years of financials. We like to get 5 years of tax returns. We also send out a document request list, which basically it's 2 pages long. Then we set up a management interview, and that can go from 1 hour to 3 hours long. We could do the analysis, and then we could come back after the analysis is done and say, hey, we need to have another conversation because something isn't jiving here. So it can get very invasive. Clients may not like that so well, but we're not judging what their financials look like or what their tax returns looks like. We're just trying to get the story. We need all that information in order to get the story, make sure the valuation is going to be complete and accurate as far as we can. Now, I'm a tax guy. If I get a tax return and I take a look at that and something doesn't look quite right, we may try to make an adjustment within our valuation because of that. I may go back to the client and say, you may want to take a look at this and go back to your CPA, maybe think about this. Also, business valuation is a mix of various disciplines. And as Tony and I have given you our background, we have a varied background. And that really helps us when we're looking at a valuation of different companies, since we have different perspectives on those companies. When we do the report, we're all said and done, and I'm reviewing it, helps us to look at it at different angles. So it's very helpful. Tony, if you could flip that. So what's a deliverable? What's most commonly done out there? And it really depends on what you need the appraisal for. Now, a full opinion of value is kind of the mother report, right? It's the most comprehensive report that's out there. It covers all three valuation approaches that are out there. And so, yes, it's going to be the most expensive approach, but it's the one you're going to need if you're going to be doing compliance work. For estate tax attorneys, if you're doing a compliance work, you're going to need that to go into your estate or gift tax return. Now, IRS basically says that if you file a return and it does not have that full opinion of value in there, they could come back and say it's not a complete and accurate return, and therefore the statute of limitations did not start running. So 10 years from when you file the return, they come back and say, hey, we're going to audit this. And you're saying, hey, it's outside of the statute. And they say, no, because you didn't have a statute, you didn't have a complete and accurate return because you didn't have a full opinion in there. So something to really pay attention to that you don't want to come back and bite you later. Now, it's going to depend, really, we'll get to this a little later. It's going to depend on what your estate tax return is about, and also where that value is. The exclusion amount, 11.6 million, basically right now. If your valuation is sitting at 5 million, probably not going to worry too much about it, but if it's sitting at 12, 13 million, you better have a full opinion in there. A calculation of value, what is that? I like to say it's like half of a full opinion. It takes basically one approach into account, and we may use another approach as a reasonableness check, but it's really telling somewhat of a story in there, and it's given some industry information, some economic information, but not as much as your full opinion is going to have. Also, a calculation report can be as simple as an executive summary that shows the value with a bunch of exhibits behind it that shows how we did the calculation, and that's going to be your calculation of value. You're going to use that for really planning purposes. If you want to know what's the estate worth right now, well, then we could do a calculation of value, give you the amount. Usually a business owner knows the story, so they don't need to hear the story, but giving an executive summary and some exhibits would be good enough for what that purpose is. So you're going to use the full opinion in estate and gift tax compliance type returns. You're going to use a calculation of value. Sometimes you can use that in general litigation. Really, it's going to be up to you to know your court system, right? What jurisdiction you're in, what do the judges, what do they normally need? Do they want a full opinion of value, or is a calculation of value good enough? So just need to pay attention to what is the purpose of the valuation. So what are you going to need for sure? Tony, so we want to get into selecting an appraiser. As Tony mentioned earlier, there's kind of an alphabet soup here of different credentials for appraisers who are going to be doing those reports, the full opinion of value or a calculation report. Now, I noticed Tony put an ASA up here to be first because that's his. No, I'm kidding. Actually, the ASA is probably the most recognized in the industry, and so I can't deny him that. CFA, Chartered Financial Analyst, ABV, which is what I have, Accredited Business Valuator, and that's through the AICPA, which is my CPA organization. Now, it used to be you have to hold a CPA in order to get an ABV, but they kind of threw that out the window, and pretty much anyone who wants to take the test now and get into valuation can get an ABV. Don't you love all these acronyms? Acronyms are great. Certified Business Appraiser, that's not as well known, and you're not going to see anything new coming out that has a CVA. CVA, Certified Valuation Analyst, that's very popular also. NACVA is a very good organization to work through. So all of these credentials here are going to be accepted in the industry, and if you take it into a court and you have somebody testifying that has one of these credentials, they're going to be seen as an expert. Judges are not going to have an issue. Your defense is not going to have an issue with that. So This last sentence here kind of pains me to say, but I would caution you against hiring a CPA without any other credentials to do your valuation. So, and the reason is, you know, it's like they do not have the training and the expertise behind it. And if you took them into a litigation case as an expert witness, that's going to be the first thing the defense is going to come at you with is, well, you're not even credentialed to do a valuation. Now, CPAs know a business, right? They know the business, they know the client, and potentially they can get to the value that would be close to what we would do through our analysis. But the problem is they're not credentialed, they're not experts in this area. We actually had a case like this last fall, and it did not go well for the CPA, let's just say that. So you just got to be careful with who you're hiring in order to do your valuations. So with that, Tony, I think you're gonna take it from there and talk a little more about the COVID.
Yeah, so I'm going to do a deep dive here into, you know, specifically COVID-19 and then what kind of how it's playing out in the markets and in valuations. So I guess just a little bit of housekeeping here. Obviously, we talked about our backgrounds. I am not a public health expert. I am not an epidemiologist. So I come at this with a level of humility. What kind of lies at the heart of what's going on is a public health crisis, and what that creates is uncertainty. Okay, so I'll come back to that point. I think there's, you know, kind of a few points that I'll be repetitive by design. You know, so as I thought about preparing for this, as appraisers or economists or investors or anyone that deals with valuation, you know, we've experienced shocks of different kinds in the past. I'm 38 years old. I remember very well the 2008-2009 financial crisis. I was working at IBM at the time, and, you know, seeing what played out there. You know, there's been commodity shocks. There's even been conflicts, wars. We've seen, you know, the dot-com bubble burst in the early 2000s. So we have an experience with lots of different kinds of shocks to the system. This COVID-19, you know, this is unique, and it's unique because of the a novel virus that we just don't know a lot about yet. You know, so I have a few bullets here in the middle of this slide. I could probably have filled up the entire time just talking about all of the open questions. You know, who is more at risk for the poor outcomes, right? I mean, there's all kinds of questions around that. I think we're learning more. If I'd given this presentation back in April, I think we know more today than we did then. And hopefully if I were to give this presentation in October, you know, there's more we could say about that. This second bullet here, the topic of schools, read just today, I believe, in fact, Governor Walz will be making an announcement on the plan for what they plan to do with school reopenings. So I've seen a couple different surveys where districts are surveying, you know, the parents in the district, and it seems that it's generally about a third and a third and a third, meaning, you know, we've got about a third of parents that are taking the perspective that are saying, you know, look, this is potentially dangerous. I don't want to put my child in harm's way. Maybe there's, you know, pre-existing conditions in the family. You know, my kid's not going in. There's about a third that take, you know, a different perspective, which is saying, look, if I have to have my school-age child at home, I can't go to work, I can't be productive, you know, maybe I no longer get a check. And then there's another third of parents that are in the middle, you know, kind of punting, right? Tell me what to do. So that creates, you know, a challenge for public health officials, and, you know, if you're school superintendents, you might be thinking, okay, well, what does that have to do with valuation? Well, in the fall, if we're taking significant, people out of the workforce, that's gonna echo through the economy, and that's gonna have an impact on our businesses, and it's gonna have an impact on what happens from a value perspective. This final bullet, something I'll probably come back to. For those that have worked with appraisers, you probably know this, but for those that haven't, a valuation exercise is forward-looking. So, as an appraiser, you really can't get around dealing with these very difficult questions that ultimately stem from a public health crisis. And so that's the challenge that appraisers are being forced to deal with when we're dealing with valuations at these recent dates. So, what do I mean by that? So I come back to uncertainty. Really what uncertainty means to an appraiser is there's greater risk around the future, which all things equal translates to lower corporate valuations, okay? There's the chart here on the right. This is just a snapshot of a point in time. What's interesting about what's happening here as we sit here in late July is the impact this virus is having on businesses, I think, is very correlated to kind of its impact on people. Right? We know there are people that are asymptomatic. We know there are people with very, very mild symptoms, all the way to critically ill. We're seeing the same thing across businesses here. So this is just a snapshot of the public markets broken down by sector and looking at the various impact in stock performance by sector. So another way to think about it is if you just sort of intuitively, right? Like if we think about, airline stocks or hotel stocks, these industries it's very intuitive that the negative impact is extreme. Some of these businesses likely won't survive and see the other end of this. But on the other end of the spectrum, if you were to invest in Amazon or Wayfair, and if you were to pull up a performance of how those companies have done and how those stocks have done year to date, you wouldn't think, if you viewed the world through the lens of Wayfair or Amazon, you wouldn't know anything was wrong. So, the point is that generalizing is going to be a particular challenge in this environment for appraisers, and they're going to really have to focus on the facts and circumstances of each business. So this is, this statement for those that have worked with appraisers, this is true pre-COVID, during COVID, and post-COVID, but it's even more true today that we really got to dig in and do the due diligence around how our particular company is being impacted. So here's a couple charts, I'll explain them. One of the job as appraisers is we have to take market data, translate it, and interpret it in how it impacts our subject company. So a couple charts here. So on the left here, all this is this is just a chart of the year-to-date stock performance of the S&P 500. So for those that aren't aware, the S&P 500 is the 500 largest publicly traded companies. It is generally used as a guide for the market broadly. As you can see, the market peaked in the second half of February and bottomed out by the second half of March. So if we were, talking about this topic in March or even April, some of the depressed values in the public markets from my seat as an appraiser, makes some sense in light of the uncertainty that this environment's creating. But what's interesting is as you look at this chart is the market has generally recovered most of those losses. I put this chart together about a week ago. It's generally true today, which is we're basically flat. So that's an interesting result from my perspective as an appraiser. It's I think, even more interesting if you move to the right. And this is a chart I pulled from McKinsey & Company. And there's kind of a lot going on with this chart, so I'll just kind of explain it. But basically what this chart is trying to illustrate is what they're doing is they're bifurcating the economy into different sectors. And they're giving estimates of when these sectors would recover, and by recover they mean kind of returning to pre-COVID GDP levels. And so kind of from left to right, like the little white dots are point estimates of if we can contain the virus, here's estimates by sector of when these sectors will expected to recover. And if you can kind of see, you know, like a lot of sectors, kind of the bottom half of the chart, late 2020 into 2021. Kind of the top half, you know, a lot of these sectors, even in a scenario where the virus gets contained, you have longer delays in when these sectors will recover. What's very interesting then is as you have the gray bars to the black dots here illustrate ranges where in scenarios where the virus is uncontained, transmission keeps occurring, you have situations where economic activity isn't expected to recover till, in many of these, late 2022, 2023, and even, you know, into 2025 and beyond. So that really, as an appraiser, that creates a dichotomy that, you know, we have to be able to explain and articulate what that means. So on the next page, we could spend an entire webinar talking about, you know, why the markets do what they do from, you know, the public market perspective. I have a few points that I'll make, but I think it's important that appraisers need to understand this and, you know, build this into their report. So a couple things. In the public markets, you know, look, we have the Fed, through their monetary policy, they can control, for lack of a better word, interest rates. The federal funds rate dictates short-term interest rates, and then through bond repurchases, they can actually affect longer-term interest rates throughout the yield curve. So in an environment where you have low interest rates, the question becomes, well, where else do investors go, right? So, you know, if I'm a money manager, does it make sense for me to reallocate funds to fixed income investments with very low returns? You know, you get in a situation where the stock market is perhaps the best place to be. This leads to what I'll call, we can talk about momentum investing. There's lots of things that can drive this, but it kind of stems from the fact, you know, again, if I'm a portfolio manager and I have funds, I'm measured on my returns quarterly. So even if I think that public companies are overvalued, I have an incentive to, as the markets are moving, to get in there and to get those returns. So you get kind of a herd mentality in the market that can take place. The last point I'll make, and, you know, maybe the strongest point, which is, you know, taking a step back, I said at the beginning, valuations are, this is a forward-looking exercise. Public markets are also forward-looking. You know, undergrads I mentioned I have a background in economics. So, you know, undergrads that take economics, I did an analysis that's very simple. You can run correlations where you'll look at, okay, if I take the market at a point in time and I compare it to economic data at the same point in time, how correlated are these two data sets? And what you find is when you do that is you get very poor results if you run the market against economic data points. What's interesting is you get stronger correlations and better relationships if you start to compare the market at a point in time with economic data at a future point in time, 1 quarter ahead, 2 quarters ahead, 3 quarters ahead. Those correlations start to improve. And that makes sense because really what markets are doing is, you know, they're thinking about the future, not necessarily what happened today. You know, I didn't put economic data on here on in terms of unemployment, right? I mean, that is, unemployment at this point is abysmal, historically bad. But what it tells me here in this final bullet is, you know, look, rightly or wrongly, markets are taking an optimistic view of the impact from the virus and thus a quick recovery in economic activity. It may be wrong, it may be right. If I give this same presentation in October, you know, maybe I no longer have to reconcile this, but these are the things, depending on the valuation date, that as I sit here in late July, these are things that an appraiser is going to have to reconcile in their report. So I've talked quite a bit about public markets, but in most situations we're dealing with, of course, private companies, right? In the private markets, you know, I say here that there's no special purchasers, right? You don't have this sort of momentum investing, these, you know, basic supply and demand factors that can drive pricing up. So our perspective is, you know, our view, my view on this is that in the private markets, you're going to be more connected to economic fundamentals than you would be in the public markets. And that creates some challenges as an appraiser. A little bit about the M&A market. For those of you that do M&A work, probably not surprising, you know, we saw M&A volume kind of deteriorate through the first quarter. So this chart here, just to explain it, this is basically monthly deal volume and aggregate deal value in the red. As you kind of look to the interesting part here is to the kind of the second half of the chart. It decreased through March and then kind of bottomed out in April, stayed low in May. But we're starting to see it uptick, and you know we're seeing that as well with our client base. You know, we at Olson Thielen, most of our clients are, I would describe as lower middle market and small businesses. But in the spring, you know, we weren't seeing any M&A activity, and I wasn't overly surprised by that. But I have been pleasantly surprised that I have seen that pick back up in our client base, and we're seeing that in the broader data. Where I'm seeing that are situations where buyers have adequate access to capital, they have the banking relationships, and most of the deals I'm seeing are for strategic reasons. So I'm not seeing a lot of necessarily financial buyers yet. I think unlike the public market data, I think from my perspective is this makes a little more intuitive sense for my seat is I think, you know, we're telling our clients, look, if you have the stomach to do M&A in this environment, I think, you know, when you have a situation like this, businesses that are aggressive and evolve and, you know, update their business models to what this world post-COVID will look like, I think they have the opportunity to come out a lot stronger. And, you know, just like with people, sometimes, you know, innovation and change comes from necessity. The same is true with businesses and our clients. So that's kind of my assessment of where the M&A market is sitting. So kind of bringing this all together, what does this mean for appraisers and what we need to be doing for valuations during this time? Basically, you know, our view is there's going to be an underweighting of market methods. You know, in part because of what I illustrated with at least at this point in time, the dichotomy within the public markets and the private markets. So we're going to be, there's going to be a much heavier reliance on earnings and cash flow. For those that do gift to the state work, that's consistent with Revenue Ruling 5960. In addition to focusing more on earnings and cash flow, I think you're also going to see, and we're certainly working with clients on scenario analysis, you know, doing some type of worst case, best case, and some sort of base case, right? And really kind of tying those scenarios to what the virus, to estimates of what the virus is going to do based on what we know at some point in time. You know, look, a lot of our clients, you know, again, in the smaller businesses and lower middle markets, a lot of our clients don't do this. But this type of sort of thought experiments as we're working with our clients, Scott made a point about potentially an evaluation can be invasive, and it's true. But this type of activity, this kind of planning activity, it sometimes can have as much value for clients as the actual result. As you think through planning, what does this mean for your business over the next 6 months, a year, 18 months? So the other point I'll make is, and I think Scott will probably touch on this a little bit more, but there various government assistance program, the CARES Act, we're seeing a lot of our clients having PPP loans. These are going to have to be dealt with and addressed through our valuation and determining, likelihood that these are going to be paid back and all those kinds of situations, which are all evolving over time. So a couple things, obviously, again, for those that have worked in this area, valuation dates are always critical, but they're going to be more critical, right? Appraisers have to work with what is known or knowable as of a date. So when we think about this pandemic, or if there's gift and estate planning that you're working with your clients on, really thinking about that valuation date in terms of the result you're looking for is going to be particularly critical. For those that get involved in lost profit cases, that Scott was referencing a deal I went and testified in court in the fall, and that was on a lost profit case. I think it's going to be, for cases like that during this period, it's going to be very challenging, I'll just say. How do you determine as an appraiser how much of your lost profit was due to some wrongful act versus the pandemic? I don't have good answers for that. It's all going to be case specific, but those are some things I think, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out and some things to look out for. I also just got an update. I'm interested in, maybe some on the phone are even dealing with some cases like this. My understanding is there's about 140 cases of business interruption cases working their way through various parts of the courts. I was notified this week, I think it was a few days ago, one of the first rulings came down to Michigan. A restaurant owner tried to get an interruption claim through their insurance provider, was rejected. They took it to court, and basically the argument from the restaurant owner was that the state issued mandates cause them to lose profits and thus property. The court in this particular case disagreed and dismissed the case. So, again, lots of cases are working through the courts. It'll be interesting to see where those play out. So I think Scott will talk a little bit more about estate planning. I would just say this for those that do this kind of work, gift and estate work. I would caution against presuming that lower valuations are necessarily gonna play out in larger discounts. My perspective on this, as I go back to the focusing on cash flows and scenario analysis, is there's more transparent ways to deal with these issues than just building in a larger discount. That doesn't mean if an appraiser is doing it, it's wrong. Doesn't mean it's going to get audited. I think it's more of an opaque way to address it. So from the perspective of our shop, I think we're not necessarily looking at it in the terms of larger discounts, but dealing with it more directly through our income approach. I think, Scott, I'll turn it back to you for more estate planning.
All right, thanks, Tony. A lot of information there to sink in. And I kind of want to touch a little more on the estate and gift tax planning. And I put here on the slide pre and post death, right? Not a whole lot of post death planning, but I think there's opportunity, especially if you're working through an estate tax return where maybe there was a death December 31st, a death January 31st. Potentially there's opportunity to choose an alternate valuation date. And the only time you'd really do that is if the estate is going to owe tax. And if there's opportunity to show that from the date of death to the alternate date, there really was a decrease in value. Now, if the date of death was, January 20th, 6 months later, we're sitting in July, and obviously the pandemic is here, which was not known at that time back in January. I think there's opportunity there to choose a different date, show that there was a decrease in value, and obviously come up with a lower estate tax. So opportunity there to think through, how do I have a lower estate tax opportunity here for my clients? Also, gifting to the next generation. Depending on what the family plan is, and business attorneys, estate attorneys, I'm sure you're all working with different families and dealing with, okay, what are they going to do with their asset, their business that's sitting in their estate? If they are thinking about gifting, now may be an excellent time to do that, depending on the industry, right? So if it's an industry that's been affected negatively because of COVID, maybe now is the time to do the gifting, because man, if it's March 31st, April 30th, obviously there's probably going to be lower projections going forward. We're taking history, but we're looking at projections, and that unknown uncertainty that Tony was talking about really gives opportunity to provide for lower value. So obviously we're not, as we said, advocates for the client, but I think we can safely say there's opportunities here to show a lower value, get more value out of their estate at a great time, if that was their planning opportunity. Now, maybe your client says, you know what, that's my baby, that's where my nest egg is, I need to have some money out of this, but I also want to give my next generation a good deal. Again, it's the same kind of opportunity to do that, because get the value lower, sell it to your next generation on a contract for deed or however. A lot of times that next generation isn't prepared to pay the price, right? Pay the whole amount. So get it on a contract for deed, got it out of their estate at a lower value, and got it down to the kids, and the owners, obviously that generation that passed it down is now receiving some income and they're happy. So everybody's happy in that situation. Now, you got to be, one thing I want people to be careful of is decisive and hesitant. I listened to a webinar that had this in there, and I thought, well, that's exactly the case. You got to be careful not to be too hesitant on the decisions, because what can happen is right now you present this to the client and, hey, there's opportunity to gift at a lower value, and they're like, oh, I'm not sure I'm ready for that. And then a year later, they're like, okay, we're ready. Well, now all of a sudden maybe the industry's taken off and you've lost a lot of opportunity there to lower the value, to lower the tax consequence. So another opportunity is controlling versus non-controlling. So maybe the person owns 70% of the company. Maybe it's an opportunity to transfer 35% of that. So a non-controlling interest, which a lot of times can produce a lower value because of some discounting, and there's opportunities there to do that. And then later on, you only own 35%, then you can transfer it or sell it at that time at a lower value also. So opportunities to lower the estate tax or even gift tax consequences right now. So you don't want to be too hesitant on that. So you got to be talking to your clients, making sure they understand everything that's out there, so that you can give good counsel to them so they can make good decisions. Another thing to think about is for business planners out there, C Corp conversions. Now I know C Corps are at a 21% tax rate, right? The best it's really ever been. And to convert to an S Corp maybe isn't always on everybody's mind, but that C Corp 21% could change depending on the political changes here in the next 2 years, 1 year, really, 1 year, 5 years down the road. The 21% is a permanent until it's changed, but opportunity to change to an S Corp right now, if your industry has been affected by COVID and that value is lower. Why is that so important? Well, you have a built-in gains tax. When you go from a C Corp to an S Corp, depending on the industry you're in, you're going to have a built-in gain. And that built-in gain could lead to built-in gains tax. If a sale happens after you do a conversion to an S Corp within 5 years after that conversion, there could be built-in gains tax. Now would be an opportunity to lower that. Tax affecting pass-throughs. Now I'm not going to go through that too much. I think Tony mentioned it a little bit, but tax affecting is something the IRS seems to think that S Corps pass-throughs don't have tax. I'm going to let that sink in for a little bit, because S corps do have tax. It's just a matter of who's paying it, right? So individuals are paying this, so obviously there's a tax being paid. And how do they normally pay that? They're taking distributions from the S corp, or taking, you know, distributions from the partnership. So it is paying tax. So there is a tax effect there. It's a hot topic. IRS hates it. Courts are being more lenient to individuals, to businesses now in allowing tax affecting. We pretty much tax affect our businesses that we're doing. We think it's a pretty safe play, but never know. It's not totally a for sure thing that's allowed, but we do it. Now, this last bullet point here kind of pains me also. Not planning is all planning is about tax savings. I mean, isn't everything about tax savings? Not really. You really need to follow the family plan still. If the family has a plan, and you know, now they're not ready to get that down to the next generation because the next generation isn't ready to take it over, well, there's opportunities to do something about that. I'm sure most business and estate attorneys know you can deal with trusts and still maintain some control by the owners. So there's still opportunity there, but you got to follow the plan. If it can be more tax efficient, that's all the better to me. So got to be paying attention to what the family really wants to do, and hopefully it can be tax efficient also. Now, I wanted to bring in some statistics here that really I think is important for everybody to see, because as you're filling out and doing the estate tax returns, and sorry, this is for estate attorneys, business attorneys, you probably want to know this too, just for planning purposes. This is stats from 2018. 8.6% of all estate tax returns were audited. Now, 8.2% were plus $10 million estates, and the rest, 0.4%, were under that. Now, why is that? Obviously, there's tax dollars involved. When you get to 10 million plus, 11.6 is the exclusion amount. So when you get to that amount, it's 40% tax, right, on those dollars over the 11.6. So they're obviously looking for tax dollars. The rest of it underneath of that, they're not necessarily too concerned about it. Opportunity there maybe. So obviously the only time you're going to file a tax return, or an estate tax return, when it's under the 11.6 is either for portability reasons, right? Or you're trying to establish basis for those assets that are sitting inside the estate. So when those get kicked out to the beneficiaries, they have the basis that they need to be able to sell it down the road. So it's kind of important to be thinking about, okay, if I'm under that exclusion amount, 11.6, where do I want that value to be? Now, again, we're not advocates for the client, but it's a good opportunity to make sure you're getting as much value into that as possible. As you see, 0.8% of all gift tax returns are audited. Pretty low percentage. I thought that was actually pretty interesting. Avoiding audits, you're not really going to avoid an audit. The number comes up, the number comes up. But we really feel like if you tell the story, now a full opinion of value basically tells a story. We're going to tell the story from history to current to where it's headed. And if that story lines up with where the value is and the IRS pays attention to that, there may be good opportunity that you're not going to get audited. You're just presenting the facts as you know them. It shouldn't be an issue. Now, I'm going to skip over the subsequent events for sake of time, get into what's the focus that the IRS is looking at in a downturn in the economy, right? Back in 2007, 2008, 2009, what were they looking at? Discount for lack of marketability, which totally makes sense, right? The market's down. Appraisers may be taking advantage of that as much as possible. And you know, you can tell a story while the market's down, the industry is down, that discount for lack of marketability could be a little higher. So that is something they're going to be paying attention to. C Corp conversions to S Corp, they're going to pay attention to that too, because obviously the value of the built-in gains that we were talking about, that could be lower. So they're going to pay attention. Skip over reasonable comp, multiple discounts. That's something, you know, or tiered discounts, however you want to look at it. How many times is something being discounted inside of a company? If I have a holding company that has an investment, and that investment has another investment. Okay, when I'm valuing that company, is there a lot of discounts going on, or do we have one main one at the end, which normally is what we look at. We do one discount at the end, but some appraisers may put a lot of discounts in there. And if they say too many, well, they may think, okay, you're double dipping or triple dipping into discounts here. You know, really, we want to bring all this information to the state attorneys, the business attorneys. So when you read these valuations, and I would really suggest you read those, you know, I understand we're the experts, right? We're the ones giving the valuation, but you should take time to read it to make sure it makes sense. And we just want to give you some pointers here, just things to be looking at, things that the IRS will be looking at when they get those returns. Some concerns that are out there really for, in my mind with the IRS, they did a lot of hiring last September for the business valuation area. And so they have a lot of new staff. They hire engineers too, so they get some good expertise, but they have a lot of new staff out there and they haven't been fully trained because, you know, obviously COVID happened, IRS shut down quite a bit of their offices. So the training is lacking. So if something gets pulled for an audit, they may not be looking at all the same things that somebody that was really trained in valuations would be looking for. And they may pick something that makes no sense. And if somebody with valuation experience read it, they'd be like, oh, that makes total sense. Don't worry about it. So there's problems out there with possibly things pulled for audit that really shouldn't be. So just an issue that's sitting there. And Congress is getting a little aggressive. They want IRS to be more aggressive on appraisers, looking for bad appraisers. Do they target appraisers? They do in local areas. If they see a couple come through that are not good, they will target appraisers. And so they will be hitting some of them with some pretty hefty penalties. So something even as attorneys, make sure you're getting good referrals for the person you're going to use before you use them, just to make sure there's not issues out there on that person. So Tony, why don't you wrap it up for us?
Thanks, Scott. So yeah, I think just our final thoughts here, kind of to bring this home. You know, look, not so much obviously for this group, but for your clients. You know, understanding that appraisers are not advocates. I think as much help as we can get from attorneys and working with clients on that point, I think is helpful from my seat. Obviously, most of the work we do with attorneys, this is going to be, as Scott kind of mentioned, it's going to be mostly full opinions of value. That's more costly, it's more time consuming. And the unfortunate reality is, you know, given all the kind of the issues that I addressed, you know, in this environment, there's additional time, potentially effort, costs to really arrive at a supportable opinion of value. You know, but look, overall, we do believe generally private company valuations are lower. You know, for the reasons we've discussed, there's a novel virus. We don't understand the epidemiology, and we don't understand, you know, how that's going to impact the economy, how it's going to change, and, you know, for that matter, our society's response to that virus is evolving and changing. That said, you know, be careful not to overly generalize, I'll say, right? You know, different businesses look very different in this environment. So we just kind of need to follow the fact pattern as best we can as appraisers and as advisors. You know, we're gonna do, appraisers are gonna focus more on earnings and cash flow. We're gonna focus on scenario modeling. And that's kind of the main tool we have in our toolkit to address some of these issues. Just checking on time here. So the final point I'll make is that this last bullet here, that this is a true statement. Pre-COVID, during COVID, post-COVID. But, you know, look, value does change, not static. I think what makes it particularly important in this environment, again, for business attorneys or state attorneys or you know, whatever the situation is, depending on how the facts and circumstances change regarding the virus, regarding our response to the virus, infection rates, all of these kinds of things, you know, value could look very, very different. right? It's, you know, if we have an April 15th valuation date versus a July 30th valuation date, you know, or some valuation date in, you know, the last quarter of the year in October, November, December, right? This is in some sense, it's going to be a very volatile time, which may make planning a bit of a challenge. But I think it's important to remind people that that's kind of the nature of what we're dealing with here. And that value in particular in this time, you know, we could see some pretty dramatic swings. So I think with that, Scott, I think that's all I have. I don't know if there's any questions.
I wanted to address the PPP loan. I think that's something that's been out there so much, and it does affect valuation. And so I guess I want to make sure people understand really the view of what I would say probably most appraisers, I don't think I'm going on any stretch there, is the PPP loan is treated as debt until it's going to be forgiven. So if it's forgiven, obviously that comes off. It's a non-taxable event. It's money they received. So it's looked at totally different. But if it's still a loan, and if you do an appraisal as of 6/30/2020 and it's on the books as a loan, we're still treating it as debt as of that time. So something to be aware of, depending on if you're planning, right? So if you want a lower value, then you may want to do a valuation as of 6/30 with that PPP loan sitting on there as debt. If you don't want a lower value, you're going to want to wait till you know that that loan is being forgiven and then do the valuation at that time. Just a note, I did read this morning that Congress has in another package that they're looking at for relief, basically trying to allow the expenses that were paid by that PPP loan to be deductible, which, you know, to me it's double dipping, but you know what, if that's part of the package, that's part of the relief package, and that at this point it's a $120 billion tax reduction. So it's pretty substantial, but that is in Congress. Congress said that that was their intent, is to allow those expenses to be deductible even if the loan was forgiven. So just something to make note. So Tony, I don't know if you wanted to address, I know we had another question, but I don't know if you want to address one here. It looks like we have a little minute, couple minutes.
Yeah, so I think I just wanted to address tax affecting, again, for those that do gifted and estate work. Scott mentioned at a high level our approach. I won't go through because we're short on time, all the case law. Some might be more familiar with it. Obviously in the 90s, this started with the Gross case, where the IRS kind of won on not tax affecting S corp or pass-through entities. For those familiar, I think recently, as Scott mentioned, you know, press case that some of that has changed. But I think just as generally our perspective on this is, you know, again, we prefer to tax effect, but you know, our view is we do recognize that there can be value, intrinsic value to this pass-through election, right? And so what we actually do is we look at the cash flows, we value the company as if it were a C corp, and we make adjustments from there based on specific facts and circumstances on what that premium might look like. Obviously, it could be a negative premium in some situations, but I think that's just to illustrate, that's kind of our perspective. We think that's a best practice, and we think sort of the more recent case rulings are supportive of that approach.
So I just had a comment by somebody to make sure. It is worth noting that anything that's on these slides, Jennifer will be sending it out to everybody. It's not attorney-client privileged, so you can do what you need to with it, just so you understand that. And I think with that, Jennifer, we'll turn it back over to you.
Sorry about that. I had trouble getting myself unmuted. Thank you to both Scott and Tony for joining us this morning. We really appreciate your time. We appreciate the support of Olson Thielen, of the bar associations. We couldn't do what we do without the support of our sponsors. So thank you both very much. Thank you to everyone joining us this morning. We hope you have a wonderful day. Take care.